Good morning and welcome to today's session of the NPTEL course Postmodernism and Literature. Our lecture's title is Post in Postmodernism, the Post in Postcolonial, Understanding Appiah. As the title implies, today we are discussing one of the important essays written by Kwame Anthony Appiah, is the Post in Postmodernism, the Post in Postcolonial. This is also one of those essays in which we can find the intersection between postcoloniality and postmodernism. Kwame Anthony Appiah was born in 1954. He is a British-born Ghanaian American theorist and also considered as one of the leading post-colonial theorists. Most of his works are in the area of cosmopolitanism. He is considered as a critic of contemporary theories of Afrocentrism. For the same reason, Appiah has also been very often critiqued as being anti-African in his approaches. And it's also significant to note that he's the first African to get a PhD in philosophy from the University of Cambridge, and he's also been described as our postmodern Socrates by the University of Stanford. So his intellectual standing is pretty high in the contemporary, given that he is considered as one of the leading philosophers and also one of the most important post-colonial and postmodern theorists of this period. The article that we are discussing today, title is The Post in Postmodernism, the Post in Postcolonial, appeared in 1991, and this is a reference to the article that appeared in the journal Critical Inquiry. I strongly encourage you to take a look at the article in order to get a better sense of the discussion that we are having today. Before we begin talking about the essay, it is important to situate it in the context of our course Postmodernism and Literature. We are discussing Appiah's essay not to talk more about postcolonialism, but to talk about the ways in which Appiah uses postmodern categories to access, to unpack, and also to critically theorize certain aspects of postcolonialism. So, if we talk about the summary of the essay, it's an unpacking of a neo-traditional sculpture by an anonymous artist from Nigeria. This work also prompts Appiah to explore the articulation of the post-colonial and the postmodern. Entering the essay from this anonymous sculpture, which is titled Man with a Bicycle, Appiah seeks to look at how things look from there, from the post-colonial spaces inhabited by a man with a bicycle. So, we could even say that the objective of the essay is to understand how things look from there, there being the post-colonial space inhabited by the work such as Man with a Bicycle. So, such an intervention is important in the contemporary because it is also important to theorize and re-theorize the post-colonial aspects from different vantage points, including the point of postmodern perspective. The problematic of Appiah's essay is set in the context of global American postmodernist culture, and most of the essays that we have been discussing in the context of postmodernism, we have also noted that American mass culture plays a very significant role in aiding the process of theorization. And this essay particularly suggests an inquiry into the relationship between postmodernism and postcolonialism, which is also the interest in terms of this course. Though this essay is located very broadly in the Western context, it works more like a critique of the position of cultural production from the periphery in the West. So, this also leads us to the assumption to be convinced that there is a certain periphery in which certain cultural productions are located in the Western scenario, and Appiah shows us how the postmodern vantage point gives us a way to access these peripheries and to theorize on these peripheries from a twin perspective of that of postcolonialism and postmodernism. And detailing further on the context, he begins by drawing our attention to an exhibition catalogue which was published in 1987. It was an exhibition titled Perspectives, Angles on African Art Exhibition. This was in the Center for African Art in New York. And he looks back at this catalogue produced in 1987, and this essay is written in 1991. So, one of the major things that prompts Appiah is to take a look at the aesthetic judgments of certain contributors of the catalogue. So, this exhibition was curated by a number of artists and a number of researchers who are working in the area of African art in the Western context. So, Appiah considers it an important thing to evaluate and also critically engage with the aesthetic judgments of certain contributors by the catalogue. And this catalogue, Appiah argues, it operates as a microcosm of the site of the African in the contemporary, which is then surely to say postmodern America. So, here we also set out to examine the idea of the African in the contemporary, especially within the context of postmodern America. Appiah also draws our attention to certain contradictory perspectives which are existing in contemporary American view of art, and he suggests that the modernist meta-narratives and the postmodern conceptions of art coexist in American society. It is this very ambivalence that he seeks to unpack and engage with in this essay. Appiah has a very interesting entry point to this essay, and which is this sculpture by an anonymous artist. In the catalogue, it is titled Man with a Bicycle, Yoruba, Nigeria, 20th Century. And Appiah uses this as an entry point and also as a piece of contemporary African art that will allow us to explore the articulation of the post-colonial and the postmodern. And this is the entry that you find in the catalogue given by James Baldwin, and this is his description of this work, Man with a Bicycle. The influence of the Western world is revealed in the clothes and bicycle of this neo-traditional Yoruba sculpture, which probably represents a merchant en route to market. Appiah latches on to the word neo-traditional, and he argues that this word neo-traditional provides a fundamental clue in entering the essay in understanding post-colonialism from a postmodern vantage point. And in his own words, I do not know how to explain this clue without first saying how I keep my bearings in the shark-infested waters around the semantic island of the postmodern. So, he uses the term neo-traditional, and he also uses this term as a clue which he thinks could be understood better through an understanding of the term postmodern. And this is how he locates the intersection of post-colonialism with that of the postmodern. Also, very briefly, Appiah takes us through this question of what postmodernism is. He does not provide any new definitions for postmodern, but he also confesses that the task of chasing the word through the pages of Lyotard, Jameson and Habermas is certainly exhausting. And we also get a sense that he very broadly subscribes to many of the definitions put forward by these postmodern theorists. And he also talks about the consensus which exists in terms of the definitions of postmodernism, such as the structure of a modern postmodern dichotomy, a rejection of exclusivity, and a rejection of everything that is considered authentic and legitimate. And this sort of a rejection, Appiah says, is almost always more playful as well. So, he talks about postmodernism from the point of view of a set definitions which also have consensus in the contemporary scenario. However, this does not essentially mean that Appiah is entirely uncritical of the ideas of postmodernism, and he also draws our attention to this idea of a transnational postmodern culture which is also global in nature, and he makes the statement, it does not mean that it is the culture of every person in the world. So, right at the outset, while engaging with the definitions of postmodernism, while talking about the ways in which he is in agreement with the dominant theories put forward by Lyotard, Jameson and Habermas, Appiah is also telling us that this does not mean that it is a very inclusive category or an inclusive definition, because a global culture, a postmodern global culture cannot be and is not the culture of every person in the world. It is from such a moment that he tries to position the sculpture titled Man with a Bicycle. To quote Appiah, if postmodernism is the project of transcending some species of modernism, which is to say some relatively self-conscious, self-privileging project of a privileged modernity, our neo-traditional sculpture of man with a bicycle is presumably to be understood by contrast as a pre-modern, that is tradition. Here he is also playing with the words in a very postmodern way. He latches upon the word new tradition and also tries to contrast it with words such as pre-modern and tradition. And this is also one of his starting points to inquire about the possibilities of unpacking post-colonialism from a postmodern vantage point. And first of all, before Appiah begins to show us how the issue looks from the post-colonial spaces, he draws our attention to how things, the issue, the postmodern issue, look from here being the dominant Western critical framework. Again, to quote Appiah, postmodernism can be seen then as a re-theorization of the proliferation of distinctions that reflects the underlying dynamic of a cultural modernity, that the need to clear oneself a space. This interestingly is a phrase that he repeatedly uses. Modernism saw the economization of the world as the triumph of reason. Postmodernism rejects that claim, allowing in the realm of theory the same proliferation of distinctions that modernity had begun. Many other critics of Appiah also harp upon this phrase about clearing a space for oneself, and also locates postmodernism as an act which is also part of this clearing space. Having shown us how the postmodern issue looks from here, from the Western point of view, he takes us to the primary objective of the essay, to show how the postmodern issue looks from the post-colonial spaces inhabited by works such as Man with a Bicycle. And with this entry point, by talking about the artistic piece Man with a Bicycle, Appiah invites us to be a part of the discussion in which he brings together the artist, culture and theory. Appiah talks about African cultural production in postmodern American society, and he also tells us that the artist is not concerned with issues of cultural imperialism or cultural autonomy. By this, he is also trying to differentiate between the aspects of theory and practice, also by showing us that the producer of the art, the artist, is not really concerned with, and perhaps is also ignorant about the ways in which culture and theory operates within the post-colonial realms. According to him, he or she, the artist, they produce to survive. The buyers are largely Western tourists, and the artist also produces these works without worrying about politics or aesthetics. And his activity in that sense is devoid of any conscious play of post-colonialism or postmodernism. In fact, the artist is only producing art as a commodity. He is also drawing our attention to the ways in which the theorizations of African art being produced as commodity is discussed in a number of realms. And this sort of an international cultural transaction, which Appiah draws our attention to, the process of transaction through which an artist from Africa is able to sell certain exotic post-colonial goods to a predominantly Western tourist consumer. This act can be analyzed using theory. But this international cultural transaction, Appiah tells us, it can be understood by a postmodern theory perhaps, but the producer or the artist does not understand the terms of that theory. And this is one of the problematics of Appiah's argument, that the artist who is producing a certain kind of cultural commodity for sale, he is not really aware of the theoretical underpinnings or the ramifications of various discourses which operate within the postmodern sphere. And in which domain does such discussion exist? According to him, Man with a Bicycle, the artistic piece produced by an anonymous Nigerian artist, is not the result of a space clearing gesture. Though it can be theorized in multiple ways using the postmodern theory, the act of producing this piece of work itself cannot be seen as a desire for space clearing. And such a concern with going beyond this understanding of space clearing, Appiah tells us it makes sense only in a domain where the distinction between high culture and mass culture operates. And this sort of a domain is also a domain occupied and dominated by the Western educated intelligentsia. And here he is also drawing our attention to certain limitations of postmodern theories and how it fails to connect with some of the ways in which artistic productions operate. And also that the mode in which particular kinds of art is produced need not always be in dialogue with the discourses, with the intellectual discourses produced by these domains dominated by a Western educated intelligentsia. To come to some of the major arguments that Appiah is leading us to in his essay, first of all, he claims that the post in the post-colonial, like the post in postmodern, it signals a space clearing gesture. And as mentioned before, the idea of space clearing has also been used by a number of other post-colonial as well as postmodern theorists. And this concern with transcending, with space clearing, Appiah suggests, is the business almost exclusively of the mediators of modernity. And it's through a mediation of modernity one is also able to cross over and engage with postmodernism. This is also something that we have taken a look at in some of the earlier sessions. And historically speaking, Appiah also tells us, though colonialism and postmodern culture, though both these aspects pervade all aspects of post-colonial cultural life, not everyone is interested or concerned with going beyond. because this idea of going beyond, this signaling of a space clearing gesture, it also happens only within the domain of only within the domains dominated by Western educated intelligentsia. So, in that sense, if we try to compare postmodernism with postcolonialism, it could be said that for the post and postcolonial, like the post and postmodern, is the post of the space clearing gesture I characterized earlier, and many areas of contemporary African cultural life, what has to become to be theorized as popular culture in particular, are not in this way concerned with transcending, with going beyond coloniality. And here he is identifying certain ways in which postmodernism intersects with postcolonialism, and also drawing our attention to the ways in which they depart from each other. So, what does this kind of an understanding entail? We need to go back to Appiah's essay again and quote extensively from him. Appiah tells us this does not mean that the theories of postmodernism are irrelevant. That is not his objective at all, to prove that the theories of postmodernism are irrelevant. On the contrary, he is arguing that the theories of postmodernism are, this does not mean that the theories of postmodernism are irrelevant to these forms of culture, for the internationalization of the market and commodification of artworks are both central to them. So, he is drawing attention to two major ideas around which postmodern theorization works: the internationalization of the market and commodification of art. But it does mean that these artworks are not understood by their producers or their consumers in terms of a postmodernism. There is no antecedent practice whose claim to exclusivity of vision is rejected through these artworks. So, there are two parts to this passage. In the first part, Appiah is drawing our attention to what he does not seek to do. His objective is not to prove that the theories of postmodernism are irrelevant to these forms of culture. On the contrary, he is also encouraging us to be alert to the fact that there is no antecedent practice whose claim to exclusivity of vision is rejected through these artworks. While postmodernism and postcolonialism at length they reject certain dominant practices, they reject certain legitimating meta-narratives, but the artist or the consumer, they need not be aware of this rejection which is being manifested mostly in the theoretical realm. And again, when we go back to the artistic piece, man with a bicycle, the artist is not self-consciously aware of the ways in which he or she is rejecting certain dominant meta-narratives through this act of producing a new traditional work. And while talking about how this domain is dominated by the Western educated intelligentsia, Appiah draws our attention to two major institutions within which certain kind of legitimation happens within the African academia as well. Firstly, he draws our attention to the African university, whose intellectual life is overwhelmingly Western. And he also highlights the fact that the Euro-American publisher and reader also play a significant role in consolidating this Western educated legitimating dominant narrative. And it is in this double dependence that we need to locate the understanding of the post-colonialism from the vantage point of postmodernism. To take his argument further, he is also comparing the sculpture, particularly in this case A Man with a Bicycle, with certain post-colonial postmodern novels. And he tells us how right from the beginning postcoloniality as a problematic turns up in the discussions of African novels. He gives an example of first generation novels by illustrating two major writers, Chinua Achebe and Kamara Lai. And Achebe was born in 1930 and he died in 2013. He was a Nigerian novelist. He also won the Man Booker Prize in 2007. Kamara Lai, who lived from 1928 to 1918, is an African writer from Guinea. Both of these writers have been seen as the representative writers of postcoloniality. And these first generation novels, and in this case Appiah is particularly talking about Achebe's Things Fall Apart and Kamara Lai's L'Enfant Noir, which is French, which is originally written in French and it was translated as The African Child. And these first generation novels, Appiah tells us, they celebrate narratives of the nation and realist legitimations of nationalism. And in that sense, they have been seen as considered as celebratory novels which also use the realist technique. And in these novels, we also can find an imaginative recreation of a common cultural past, sort of a return to the traditions. And here we also find that Achibe's and Lai's novels, they also recognize the demands of a rationalized modernity. And on the other hand, he is also drawing our attention to a set of novels which he refers to as second generation novels in the context of post-coloniality. He particularly mentions Yambo Ulam's work Bound to Violence. It is also a Francophone novel published in the 1960s, which was originally written in French and later translated into many other languages. These novels, such as Ulam's novel Bound to Violence, they deconstruct precisely the legitimating narratives which were part of the first generation post-colonial novels. So, the celebration of the nation and nationalism, which was part of these first generation writers, they completely disappear when it comes to the second generation post-colonial writers, who are also postmodern. And in Appiah's own words, after colonialism, the modernizers said comes rationality. That is the possibility that the novel rules out. So, not just from a theoretical standpoint, but also through the narrative. Writers such as Yambo Ulam, they completely reject the possibilities which were celebrated and legitimated by the first generation novelists. And in this case, Appiah also tells there is an assault on realism and nativism, which are predominantly seen in these narratives. And in that sense, they could also be considered as post-nationalist, post-realist and post-nativist. And these are also the terms, interestingly, that one could use to talk about postmodernism as well. So, it is very fascinating to note the ways in which he plays with the term post, how Appiah uses the prefix post to talk about various things which could be brought together under the rubric of postmodernism. And this sort of a writing, which is largely post-nationalist, post-realist and post-nativist, Appiah argues it's also leading to a certain kind of an intersection between post-colonialism and pessimism. To quote Appiah, post-realist writing, post-nativist politics, a transnational rather than a national solidarity and pessimism, a kind of post-optimism to balance the earlier enthusiasm for Hamadou Karuma's Sons of Independence. It is also a leading post-colonial novel. So, when it comes to the post-colonial period, characterized by post-realism, post-nativism and a transnational solidarity rather than a national solidarity, Appiah feels that it also leads to a certain kind of a production of pessimism, because it is post-nationalist and it is also post-optimistic. So, post-colonialism is being identified with a certain post-optimistic feeling, which he designates as being pessimistic. So, according to Appiah, how does he define post-coloniality? And post-coloniality, he says, comes after all this, and its post, like that of a postmodernism, is also a post that challenges earlier legitimating narratives, and it challenges them in the name of the suffering victims of more than 30 African republics. So, here Appiah is talking about post-colonialism in similar ways in which postmodernism has been defined as a post which challenges earlier legitimating narratives. But we cannot entirely say that they are one and the same, because we have also discussed about the ways in which postmodernism is largely considered as being apolitical, while post-coloniality is also a political position. So, what is Appiah's premise when he talks about the intersection of post-colonialism and postmodernism? According to him, the African writers who challenge the legitimating narratives of the nation in a postmodern manner that Appiah otherwise seems to approve of. For instance, at the beginning, when Appiah begins talking about the post-colonialism and postmodernism, he seems to be in agreement with Lyotard when he talks about the rejection of meta-narratives. But these the ways in which he approves of this challenge on meta-narratives is found a bit problematic when he comes to the post-colonial, postmodern novels. Instead of celebrating the challenge on meta-narratives, he seems to not approve of a certain post-coloniality, which also leads to a condition of pessimism. So, in this is also one of the critiques raised against Appiah's premises, Appiah's arguments, that by rejecting nationalism, Appiah feels that these writers have produced a bad kind of post-coloniality, and this also departs from the proper sense of the term that Appiah wants to have for the term post-colonialism. And again, many have felt that there is no way in which one could talk about a good post-coloniality and bad post-coloniality. And talking about Appiah's arguments, one of the things that has come up in many of the critiques against Appiah is that while he seems to be okay with the questioning of the legitimating narratives in the postmodern scenario, he completely fails to see the possibility of the second generation post-colonial writers questioning or even deconstructing and rejecting the idea of nationalism. Appiah feels that such a position, which also leads one to produce pessimistic narratives about nation, about the condition of post-coloniality. In this condition, the post-colonial intellectuals, they also face the risk of becoming otherness machines. In his own words, this is especially true when post-colonialism meets postmodernism, for what the postmodern reader seems to demand of Africa is too close to what modernism demanded of it. This brings us to a key argument that Appiah foregrounds, that the post-colonial intellectual writing in the postmodern period, he or she seems to be closer to the demands of modernism than the demands of postmodernism. This is why he considers it important to compare the sculpture, the artistic piece Man with a Bicycle, with the post-colonial novels produced also by the intellectuals of a Western educated institution. And in works such as Man with a Bicycle, Appiah argues the contemporary cultural production of African societies, it can work as an antidote to the dark vision of the post-colonial novelist. Appiah seems to lament the fact that the post-colonial writers of the contemporary, of the postmodern period, they fail to go beyond the production of a pessimistic narrative by rejecting the idea of nation and the idea of nationalism. And to quote extensively from Appiah, I am grateful to James Baldwin for his introduction to the Man with a Bicycle, a figure who is, as Baldwin so rightly saw, polyglot, speaking Yoruba and English, probably some Hausa and a little French, for his trips to Cotonou and Cameroon, someone whose clothes do not fit him too well. He and other men and women among whom he mostly lives suggest to me that the place to look for hope is not just to the post-colonial novel, which has struggled to achieve the insights of Ulam or Mudimbe, but to the all-consuming vision of this less anxious creativity. It matters little whom the work was made for. What we should learn from is the imagination that produced it. Man with a Bicycle is produced by someone who does not care that the bicycle is the white man's invention. It is not there to be the other to the Yoruba self. It is there because someone cared for its solidity. It is there because it will take us further than our feet will take us. It is there because machines are now as African as novelists and as fabricated as the kingdom of makeup. This is a very important sum up that Appiah brings us to. And he also believes that, he also argues that the postmodern artistic production, such as the neo-traditional sculpture Man with a Bicycle, there is more room for imagination, there is more room for possibility in comparison to the postmodern, in comparison to the post-colonial novel. And he also identifies a certain kind of an anxious creativity in the post-colonial, postmodern novels, which he also feels is absent in this postmodern new traditional production Man with a Bicycle. And he also perhaps is arguing that it is important to move beyond those restricting limitations within which post-colonial, postmodern novel works, and how it also leads us to a pessimistic narrative. And he eulogizes in that sense the productions such as A Man with a Bicycle, where this anxiety is relatively lesser and almost absent, and where the imagination of the machine, the imagination of modernity is taken to an idea of progress in the way that post-colonial novel has not been able to do. And this is a kind of problematic which lies at the heart of the discussion of Appiah's essay, and he's also been critiqued. Appiah has also been critiqued heavily for being unkind to the post-colonial novelists, for seeing them as more pessimistic than seeing them as new possibilities or as new opportunities in the postmodern moment. So, how do we now begin to look at the in postmodernism and postcolonialism? Both postmodernism and postcolonialism function as a challenge to early legitimating narratives. Appiah also seems to highlight this consensus. and he also applauds postmodernism as defined by Lyotard. But the problem arises when Appiah is ambivalent on the point of postmodern's relation to nationalism. He also draws their attention to the fact that it becomes possible for the challenge to exist only because the conditions being challenged continue to exist. So, as long as the enemy is still there in the form of meta-narratives, in the form of grand narratives, the battle goes on. The challenge against the meta-narratives, the challenge against these dominant positions, that will continue to go on. And to sum up, Appiah is arguing for a space clearing that allows post-colonial discourse a figurative flexibility, and at the same time he is also reaffirming its radical locality within historical exigencies. And this essay is particularly important for us to access post-colonialism through the vantage point of postmodernism, because it also talks about the discrete and firm segregation of the post-colonial from the postmodern. In certain ways, he seems to be more comfortable with the articulations of the postmodern in works such as Man with the Bicycle than with the articulations of postmodern in the second generation post-colonial novels. Appiah is also pointing out the need to have a different entry point to talk about art from a post-colonial space, to talk particularly about postmodern art from a post-colonial space. And this essay, as we had indicated in the beginning, the objective of this essay, the objective of today's discussion is not to engage in a discussion of post-colonialism or post-coloniality, but to show how postmodernism could be used as a category, could be used as an entry point to unpack certain kinds of post-colonialisms which are displayed in the contemporary. And Appiah's essay certainly shows us how the intersection is being made possible, and how one could talk about post-colonialism in different ways when we access it with the tools provided by postmodern theorists. So, with this we come to the end of today's lecture. I again encourage you to take a look at Appiah's original essay to understand some of the ways in which the intersection is being made possible. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.